The taste was metallic, a familiar copper penny tang that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with exhaustion. It was the flavor of 3 a.m., of my third espresso shot hitting a stomach lined with anxiety and a forgotten dinner. I was staring at a spreadsheet, the glowing green and red cells blurring into a meaningless mosaic of other people's profits and losses. My heart was doing that thing again, a frantic, bird-like flutter against my ribs, a panicked signal from a body I had long treated as an inconvenient vehicle for my ambition. This was the pinnacle. The corner office on the 40th floor, the 7-figure salary, the respect that came with being the youngest partner in the history of the firm. By every external metric, I, Aris Thorne, had arrived. And I had never been more miserable, more hollowed out, more utterly lost. The realization didn't come as a thunderclap, but as a slow, chilling seep of understanding, like ice water filling a glass. I was a ghost in my own life. I had curated this existence with the precision of a master strategist, checking off every box society had laid out for success. But the I, who was supposed to enjoy this success, the core essence of who I was, had been silenced, starved, and left behind in the relentless pursuit of an ideal. I was living a life of profound self-abandonment. That night, I didn't have a dramatic breakdown. I simply closed my laptop, stood up from my achingly expensive ergonomic chair, and walked out. I didn't clean out my desk. I didn't send a resignation email. I just left. It was the first, terrifying, and utterly necessary act of self-love I had performed in over a decade. I chose my own crumbling sanity over a pristine, gilded cage. This was revolutionary. My entire life had been a war against my present reality, a constant striving for a future state of enoughness. The idea of just accepting where I was, without the accompanying shame, felt like laying down a heavy burden I didn't even know I was carrying. I started small. Uketamo. I accept that I feel anxious today. I accept that I am sad. I wasn't agreeing to feel this way forever. I was just stopping the exhausting fight against what was. The second tool was the practice of Ikebana itself. Hana one day placed a shallow bowl, a kenzan, a spiked frog, and a few branches and flowers in front of me. "Now, you will arrange," she said. I, a master of complex financial models, was stumped by a branch and a chrysanthemum. My first attempts were rigid, symmetrical, and awful. I was trying to force the materials into a preconceived notion of what was right. Hana watched patiently. "You are still fighting the roots," she said. "In Ikebana, you do not force the branch. You study it. You learn its natural line, its shusho, its essential character. You work with it. You honor its asymmetry, its imperfections. That is where the beauty lies. Your mind is like this branch. You have been trying to force it to grow straight when it naturally curves. You must learn its shusho." The act of carefully studying a branch, of noticing its subtle twists, the way the light hit a particular leaf, was a form of active meditation. It taught me observation without immediate judgment. I began to apply this to my own thoughts. Instead of being swept away by a wave of "I'm a failure," I could observe the thought, "Oh, there is the thought of being a failure again." It created a tiny, crucial space between the I and the thought. The thought was just a branch. It wasn't the whole tree. This was my introduction to mindfulness, a concept backed by a wealth of Western neuroscience I would later devour, showing how it physically changes the brain structure, strengthening the prefrontal cortex and dampening the amygdala's panic response. My journey was no longer a passive collapse. It was becoming an active exploration. I started reading not business journals, but psychology, philosophy, and neuroscience. I learned about the polyvagal theory from Dr. Stephen Porges, understanding how my constant state of fight or flight had dysregulated my nervous system, making genuine calm feel impossible. I learned about the work of Dr. Kristen Neff on self-compassion, which was a direct assault on the director's reign of terror. Self-compassion, I learned, had three components: self-kindness versus self-judgment, common humanity versus isolation, and mindfulness versus over-identification. I started practicing. When the director would rant, I would literally talk to myself out loud in the mirror. This is a moment of suffering. It's okay. It's human to feel this way. Many people feel this way. May I be kind to myself in this moment? It felt absurd, pathetic at first, but the neural pathways of self-flagellation were so well worn, I had to consciously, awkwardly, start carving new ones. I also discovered the work of Bessel van der Kolk on trauma and the body. I realized my years of chronic stress were a form of trauma. I had been living entirely in my head, and my body was a numb, neglected machine. Hana had already introduced me to this through Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing. She would go to a park, and she would instruct me not to hike, but to be. Use your senses, she would whisper. Feel the texture of the bark. Listen to the layered sounds of the leaves on the distant traffic. Smell the damp earth. It was a full-body reboot. I started practicing yoga. Not the intense calorie-burning kind, but gentle yin yoga, where you hold poses for minutes, learning to sit with discomfort and breathe through it. I was literally re-inhabiting my own skin. A major turning point came when I decided to tackle what I called my origin story, the childhood programming that had set this all in motion. With the shaky courage I was beginning to cultivate, I called my parents. I didn't go to blame them. I went with a new intention, born of Uketamo and self-compassion, to understand and to state my truth. The conversation was stilted and difficult. My father, ever the pragmatist, was baffled. But you had everything, Aris. We gave you every opportunity. It was my mother who, after a long silence, said something that cracked the universe open for me. I suppose we were just so afraid of you becoming complacent. We saw so much potential in you. We thought if we pushed you, you would be safe. You would never have to struggle like we did. It wasn't a malicious plot. It was fear. Their love, however misdirected, was rooted in a desire for my safety and success. In that moment, the deep, frozen knot of resentment I'd carried in my chest for 2 decades began to thaw. I didn't excuse their behavior, but I understood it. And in understanding, I could finally separate their narrative of me from my own. I could thank them for their intention while consciously choosing to release the burden of their methodology. I am learning to define my own success now, and it looks different than what you imagined. Letting go of that narrative was like being released from a gravitational pull I hadn't known was holding me down. The director's voice didn't vanish, but it lost its authority. It became a background radio station I could choose to tune out. I started to explore what truly brought me joy, separate from achievement. I had loved drawing as a child, but had abandoned it because I wasn't the best in my class. I bought a cheap sketchbook and some pencils and started again. My drawings were clumsy, amateurish, and it was okay. The joy was in the process, the feel of the graphite on paper, the quiet focus. It was an activity with no goal other than the doing of it. I started cooking elaborate meals, not for anyone else, but for the sensual pleasure of chopping vegetables, smelling herbs, and creating something nourishing for my own body. This was all part of building what I now call my inner sanctuary. It's a concept I built from various teachings,
a psychic space of unconditional safety and self-acceptance. When the world feels overwhelming or when old triggers arise, I have a practiced internal place to retreat to. I visualize a quiet, sunlit room, a bit like Hana's apartment. In it, I am safe. I am enough. No external validation is required for entry. The journey wasn't linear. There were days I was gripped with panic about my dwindling savings, days the director would stage a coup and I'd spend an afternoon in a fetal position on the floor, convinced I had ruined my life. But the tools were there now. I could ride the wave instead of drowning in it. I learned to treat myself with the same patience and kindness Hana had shown that bonsai tree. About a year into my metamorphosis, a former colleague reached out. He had heard through the grapevine I was unwell and offered condolences, then quickly pivoted to a business proposition. He was starting a new fintech venture and wanted me as his COO. The offer is even more than you were making at the firm, Otis. A chance to get back in the game with a killer team. The old me would have salivated. It was validation. It was a life raft back to the world I knew. I felt the pull, the addictive lure of external approval. I thanked him, asked for a few days to consider, and sat with the decision. I didn't ask what others thought. I didn't consult my parents or even Hana. I went into my inner sanctuary and I asked the only person who mattered, myself. The answer was a clear, resonant, and peaceful no. The game he was talking about was a game I no longer wanted to play. My definition of success had completely been rewritten. Success was no longer a title or a number in a bank account. Success was inner peace. It was the ability to feel a full range of emotions without being terrorized by them. It was the quiet joy of a morning sketch, the profound connection of a mindful walk, the deep satisfaction of a nourishing meal I cooked for myself. It was the freedom that came from no longer being a hostage to my own relentless expectations. When I called him to decline, my voice was steady and calm. I didn't give a long explanation. I simply said, "Thank you for the incredible offer, but it's not the right path for me." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by a confused, "Okay, well, if you change your mind." I knew I wouldn't. That was the moment I knew my self-love was no longer a theory or a practice, it was my operating system. I had chosen myself, my peace, my authenticity, over a gilded cage, and in that choice,